General Hospital spoilers reveal that the shot had already been fired, and the consequences were irreversible. Drew Kane's body lay crumpled on the floor, his chest riddled with bullets, his final breath drowned beneath the weight of betrayal. The man who once held secrets, power, and influence in Port Charles was now reduced to a lifeless form, his blood soaking into the hardwood like ink bleeding across a confession. The silence in the room was oppressive, suffocating, stretching into a stillness that screamed louder than any siren. Willow Tate stood over him, her hands trembling not with remorse but with a cold clarity that no one would have expected from her. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't self-defense. This was a decision, calculated, executed, and necessary in her unraveling logic. Drew's death didn't break her. It crystallized her. And in that moment, everything about her shifted. What happened next wasn't chaos. It was control. Willow didn't run. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. Instead, she breathed, slow, deep, and deliberate. It was as if killing Drew had finally allowed her to reclaim a part of herself that had been caged by heartbreak, humiliation, and helplessness. There was no turning back now. She had eliminated the first obstacle. But there was still another. Michael Corinthos. The man who claimed to love her, the man who fathered her children, and the man who, in her eyes, had locked her out of her own life. He had become judge and jury, gatekeeper and executioner, deciding when and how she could see her children, as if her motherhood was negotiable. In her fractured state of mind, Michael was no longer just a source of pain. He was the next threat to her safety, her identity, and her children. He was the next to fall. But Willow understood that simply removing Michael the same way she had erased Drew would not be enough. This next move had to be cleaner, smarter, more indirect. That was when Nina Reeves entered the frame, not just as a mother, but as a silent co-conspirator. Nina didn't flinch when Willow told her what she had done. She didn't scold or recoil in horror. Instead, she sat down, poured a drink, and whispered, "Then we fix it." And just like that, a new alliance was born. One forged not in blood, but in desperation. One rooted not in love, but in survival. They knew the clock had started ticking. The sound of Drew's final breath would echo through the coming days, and they needed to act before questions turned into evidence. They began to plan, not out of panic, but with icy precision. The story they would tell was already beginning to take shape. Michael had been angry. Michael had been controlling. Michael had threatened both of them. Nina would leak whispers to Olivia, vague comments about Michael's erratic behavior, his resentment toward Drew, his fears of losing power over Wiley and Amelia. Willow would play the role of the wounded mother, too afraid to speak up before, but finally stepping into her truth. Every conversation would be rehearsed. Every tear would be real enough to believe, but manufactured enough to protect. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about narrative. And in Port Charles, whoever controlled the story controlled the outcome. The murder weapon, cold and silent, was carefully placed in Michael's bedroom at Carly's house. Not thrown carelessly, but hidden, strategically, deliberately. Willow knew how Dante Falconeri operated. She knew where evidence would be searched, what questions would be asked. She planted the seed, and Nina ensured it would grow. A few well-placed comments, a few strategic texts, and soon, suspicion would no longer hover over Willow. It would fall squarely on Michael. And then came the performance. Willow's public face became that of a grieving ex, devastated by Drew's death, confused by Michael's coldness, desperate to reconnect with her children. Her pain looked real. It felt real. But it was a mask. Beneath it was a woman willing to do anything to reclaim what she believed had been stolen from her. Her freedom, her motherhood, her identity. She told herself that the lies were necessary, that Michael had pushed her to this, that Drew had been warned. She wasn't acting out of hatred. She was acting out of protection. She was the mother defending her cubs. And if blood had to be spilled to ensure that, then so be it. Nina, for her part, played the role of the concerned grandmother perfectly. She whispered to Sunny, to Carly, to the nurses at GH. She weaved threads of concern, of suspicion, of alarm. And slowly, the picture they painted began to take hold. Michael was unstable. Michael was angry. Michael had motive. By the time the police found the gun, wrapped in cloth and tucked away behind Michael's dresser, the web had already been spun. Dante, torn between loyalty and duty, had no choice but to act. He read Michael his rights. The handcuffs closed. And the narrative became reality. But the truth, buried beneath layers of lies and guilt, refused to stay silent. Somewhere deep inside, Willow still heard it. Still felt it. Drew had begged for his life. Michael had trusted her. And now both were gone in their own ways, one in death, the other in disgrace. But Willow didn't stop. She couldn't. The momentum of obsession had become unstoppable. She told herself this was justice. This was balance. And as long as she ended up with her children in her arms and her past behind her, the means would always justify the end. Willow wasn't the victim anymore. She wasn't even the hero of her own story. She had become something else entirely. Something colder. Sharper. More dangerous. And with Nina by her side, the two women now stood at the center of a carefully constructed storm, ready to blame, to lie, to protect their version of truth at any cost. Drew was dead. Michael was behind bars. And the story was far from over. Because in Port Charles, secrets always surface, and when they do, the question won't just be what Willow did. It will be whether anyone can stop her before she does it again. The moment Michael Corinthos was arrested, something inside the fabric of Port Charles tore irreparably. It wasn't just the metallic click of the handcuffs around his wrists, or the flash of the patrol car's lights reflecting in his mother's horrified eyes. It was the collective realization that everything was changing. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a procedural mistake. It was a calculated act, deliberately orchestrated, meticulously staged, and now, devastatingly effective. The fingerprint evidence on the gun that killed Drew Kane had sealed Michael's fate in the eyes of law enforcement and the public. There were no questions asked, no benefit of the doubt, no room for logic, just the weight of forensic proof. The same man who once stood as a respected businessman and devoted father now stood accused of cold-blooded murder. And behind it all was an obsession so powerful, so consuming, that it warped everything in its path. The obsession belonged to Willow. And with Drew's blood on the floor and Michael in a jail cell, the extent of that obsession was only just beginning to reveal itself. This was no impulsive act of grief. It was a transformation. One born in silence, shaped in the shadows, and now unleashed like a storm no one could stop. Willow had crossed a line so profound that even she could no longer see the woman she used to be. She no longer mourned the loss of her family, she strategized its reconstruction. She no longer pleaded for her children, she plotted for their return. Every move was deliberate, every tear calculated, every lie rehearsed until it became the only truth she needed. Drew's death had been the first shift in her new reality. The moment she pulled the trigger, she didn't just end a life, she rewrote her own. The old Willow, full of hesitation and emotional fragility, died with Drew. What emerged was a version of her who saw the world in terms of obstacles and objectives. Drew had been an obstacle, he paid the price. And now Michael, the man who once held her heart but who now stood in her way, had become the next target. The fingerprint on the murder weapon was no coincidence. It had been planted with surgical precision. Willow knew where Michael had been, what he touched, how he moved. She timed it perfectly. She didn't just plant the gun in his room, she ensured his print would be there. It wasn't enough to implicate him, she had to make sure there was no way out. And in this terrifying reinvention, Willow didn't act alone. Nina, once desperate for her daughter's affection and absolution, saw an opportunity in the wreckage. She stepped into the storm with Willow not as a parent desperate to protect, but as a co-architect of the disaster unfolding around them. She had watched her daughter crumble beneath the weight of grief and injustice and decided to help her rebuild with steel and fire. Together, they created a new story. One where Willow was the victim of Michael's cruelty, one where Drew had been a pawn in a larger game of control, and one where the only path to justice was through destruction. As Michael was led away in handcuffs, the entire town began to fracture. Carly's cries echoed through the station as she demanded answers, demanded justice, demanded someone look beyond the obvious. But all anyone could see was the evidence. The murder weapon. The fingerprints. The motive. However twisted it had been made to look. Michael had kept Willow from her children, they said. Michael had refused to forgive her. Michael had expressed anger at Drew's involvement. And now Drew was dead. It all made sense, because Willow and Nina had made sure it would. The media devoured the story. Headlines branded Michael as a murderer. The courtroom filled with speculation. Even those closest to him began to waver. Jocelyn questioned whether Michael had told her everything. Dante, though desperate to believe his friend was innocent, was forced to acknowledge the weight of the evidence. Sonny was silent, his face a stone mask, his loyalty torn. And in the center of it all, Michael sat alone, stunned not just by the accusation, but by the knowledge that someone he loved had done this to him. Deep inside, he knew. He couldn't prove it, but he knew. He saw it in the way Willow didn't visit. In the way Nina looked at him, calm and composed, as if the verdict had already been written. This wasn't a legal case. This was a psychological war. Willow had learned to weaponize perception, to use silence as a shield and pain as a sword. She spoke little publicly, but every statement was carefully constructed to suggest fear, confusion, and sadness. She painted herself as the mother caught in a tragedy, the woman surrounded by men who used her as leverage. Her lies became community truths, whispered in salons and hospital corridors, cemented through repetition and bias. And through it all, the obsession grew. Not just hers, but the town's. Everyone became obsessed with what Michael might have done. Everyone became obsessed with justice. No one stopped to question whether the obsession itself had become the real danger. No one asked what Willow had become. No one noticed how her eyes no longer watered, how her voice never trembled, how her grief had been replaced by unwavering certainty. She wasn't trying to survive anymore, she was trying to dominate. And now that she had seen what she could do, she would never go back. Michael's arrest wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one drenched in control, manipulation, and the slow, quiet erosion of innocence. The fingerprint wasn't just a clue, it was a weapon. It was the final touch in a masterpiece of madness. A fingerprint placed not by accident, but by obsession. And it worked. It destroyed a man's life, rewrote a family's legacy, and allowed Willow to reclaim the only thing she had ever wanted, control. But how long can a lie built on blood and betrayal survive? How long before the cracks begin to show? How long before someone sees the truth, and dares to speak it? Because when the obsession becomes the only truth someone believes in, everyone else becomes a target. And Port Charles may soon learn that the worst has not yet come. The disaster isn't over. It's only just beginning. The illusion of justice in Port Charles had collapsed the moment Michael Corinthos was arrested, but what followed was far more insidious, a slow, calculated shift in power, truth, and perception. The story that now consumed the town was no longer about Drew Kane's murder alone. It had become a symbol of how obsession could distort reality, how carefully constructed lies could harden into widely accepted truth. Michael's arrest, driven by the so-called discovery of his fingerprints on the murder weapon, became the centerpiece of this new reality. It was the confirmation of a disaster born not from chance, but from control, a manufactured sequence of events carefully threaded together by two women, Willow and Nina. Their newfound alliance, once rooted in grief and misunderstanding, had evolved into something far more chilling, something that neither of them seemed willing to stop. Because this wasn't just about protecting themselves anymore. This was about reshaping the entire narrative of their lives and removing anything, or anyone, that threatened the fragile foundation they had built. And now that Michael was behind bars, their obsession had taken on a terrifying momentum. Willow's transformation was the most disturbing. Once seen as gentle, nurturing, and tragically broken, she had now emerged as something much colder, more precise. Her love for her children had mutated into something fierce and unforgiving, a singular focus that allowed no compromise, no morality. Her grief over losing access to Wiley and Amelia had metastasized into a deep-rooted belief that Michael himself was the enemy, not just of her motherhood, but of her sanity, her identity. And in that belief, she found permission to rewrite everything. Drew was eliminated first. Then came the evidence. Then the plan to pin it all on Michael. The narrative was rewritten with deadly clarity. In the eyes of the public, Willow was the abandoned woman, a mother cast aside, grieving and bewildered by the death of a man who had once tried to help her. Michael was the angry ex, bitter and territorial, now accused of eliminating Drew in a jealous, impulsive rage. The people of Port Charles didn't question the details, they accepted them, because the story was too perfect to deny. But while the town watched with fascination and judgment, Sonny and Carly saw the truth, or at least the hollow shape of it. They knew Michael was innocent. They could feel it in their bones. Carly, gutted by the thought of her son locked away for a crime he didn't commit, began to unravel as well, but in a different way. Her grief was still tempered by fury. Her every waking moment was spent interrogating those close to Willow, pressuring lawyers, demanding action from police who no longer seemed invested in finding real answers. Sonny, more composed but no less desperate, began building a quiet network behind the scenes. He reactivated old informants, former WSB contacts, and trusted allies who owed him favors. Together, Sonny and Carly formed a line of defense around Michael, but no matter how hard they pushed, they kept hitting walls. Walls built from lies so seamless, they no longer looked like lies at all. And that was when Jason stepped in. Jason, who had been moving in silence, detached from the public chaos, finally re-entered the equation with the cool certainty of a man who didn't need permission to act. He had seen too many lies unravel. He had seen too many enemies fall. But this was different. This wasn't a cartel or a syndicate. This was family. And the lies were not just criminal, they were personal. Jason saw the cracks others ignored. He noticed the slight shifts in Willow's behavior, the rehearsed sorrow, the calculated tone in her voice. He knew when grief was real and when it was manufactured. Willow's version of events didn't feel like pain. It felt like a performance. And Jason knew that if he didn't start pulling it apart, no one would. He began with the evidence. The gun. The fingerprints. The timeline. Everything seemed too perfect. The weapon was discovered in Michael's bedroom at Carly's house, a place so obvious and emotionally charged that it practically screamed frame job. But the police didn't question it. The fingerprint analysis was fast-tracked. The case moved through the system as though it had been planned from the start. Jason followed the trail backward. He looked into Drew's last known contacts. He tracked Willow's movements. He uncovered inconsistencies. Timestamps that didn't align, gaps in surveillance, people who claimed they had seen Drew after the time he was supposedly killed. There were cracks everywhere. All he needed was the right angle to shatter the whole illusion. Meanwhile, Nina stood as the silent architect beside Willow, feeding the story with quiet whispers and strategic emotion. She didn't speak directly about Michael's guilt, but she planted doubt everywhere she went. She met with people, leaked selective information, manipulated context to ensure that the suspicion stayed fixed on him. Nina knew how to navigate public perception, and she used that skill like a scalpel, cutting down anyone who dared to defend Michael. In private, she and Willow grew more confident. They believed they had won. That Michael would be convicted. That Willow would regain full control of her children. That the truth, no matter how distorted, would be buried under the weight of their new reality. But Jason wasn't interested in preserving comfort. He wanted the truth, no matter how ugly, no matter who it hurt. his investigation began to unearth troubling details. A disposable burner phone used to call Drew before his death. A fingerprint partial that didn't belong to Michael. A deleted message on Willow's account that had been recovered through encrypted backups. Slowly, Jason was gathering the evidence needed to dismantle the lie. But it was a race against time. The trial was approaching. Michael's reputation was destroyed. The town had chosen sides. And even some of those closest to him had started to pull away. Carly clung to hope, but her anger boiled into public confrontations. She accused Nina in front of Olivia. She confronted Willow with veiled threats. But it was Jason's calm, quiet pursuit of the truth that would determine whether this obsession-fueled disaster could be reversed. Because at its core, this wasn't just about one man's freedom. It was about the corrosive power of obsession, how it can masquerade as love, as justice, as protection, while devouring everything in its path. Willow's transformation into someone who could kill Drew, frame Michael, and still believe she was doing it for her children, marked a turning point not just for her, but for the entire Corinthos family. Control was the real weapon. Not the gun. Not the courtroom. But the power to rewrite truth and bend others to believe it. Willow and Nina had mastered that weapon. But Jason had returned to dismantle it, brick by brick. Because somewhere, beneath the layers of grief, betrayal, and rage, the real truth was still waiting to be uncovered. And once revealed, it would not only free Michael, it would expose how far obsession had driven Willow from the person she once was, and how much damage one lie, perfectly told, could do to an entire city. The story wasn't just changing. It was accelerating. And the cost of silence was about to become more devastating than anyone in Port Charles could possibly imagine.